The sound of breaking glass cut through the quiet like a scream. I spun around, my heart jolting, the dish towel slipping from my fingers. The living room window was shattered, shards glinting on the floor. Cold air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of rain. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took in the scene. My son, eyes wide with panic, and beside him, his best friend, frozen in shock, a basketball at his feet. "Mom, I'm so sorry," my son blurted out, his voice tight. Before I could respond, his friend stepped forward. "It was my fault," he said firmly, his eyes meeting mine. "I'll pay for the window. I'm really sorry." His calmness surprised me. Most teenagers I knew would stammer and squirm under pressure, but he stood there with an odd sort of maturity. I swallowed, the initial rush of anger melting into something else, resignation, maybe, or exhaustion. "Just get the broom," I muttered, waving a hand toward the closet. My voice sounded flat, the weight of the broken window pressing down on me. As they started sweeping, I couldn't help but notice him. He was taller than I remembered, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he worked. He moved carefully, gathering each piece of glass with a steady hand. My son muttered apologies as he swept, but his friend's gaze remained focused on the task. I knelt to help, the chill from the broken window seeping into my skin. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same shard, and I jerked back, embarrassed by how my breath caught. He glanced at me, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't mean to scare you. It's not your fault," I said, forcing a small smile. "Accidents happen." We finished cleaning, and I taped a sheet of plastic over the window. The wind rattled it, a flimsy barrier against the cold. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the chill. My son grabbed his jacket and mumbled something about going to the store. Before I could stop him, the door slammed shut, leaving me alone with his friend. The silence felt heavy, stretching out between us. He stood there, shifting his weight, his eyes flicking toward the window. "I really am sorry," he said softly. "It's just a window," I replied, brushing hair from my face. "Nothing that can't be fixed." He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine a moment too long. "Still, I feel bad." A wry smile crossed my lips. "You should feel bad for giving me a drafty house." He laughed, and the sound was warm, unexpected. "I'll come back tomorrow and help fix it properly," he offered. "You don't have to do that," I said quickly, though something in me didn't want to refuse. "I want to," he insisted. His voice was gentle, steady. A strange warmth curled in my chest, and I pushed it down, confused by its presence. He was my son's friend, after all. Just a polite young man trying to fix a mistake. I turned back to the kitchen, needing something to do with my hands. "I should start dinner. Can I help?" he asked. I hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure. If you know how to chop vegetables." He grinned. "I'm a quick learner." We worked side by side, the rhythm of chopping and stirring filling the silence. It felt oddly natural, his presence easing the weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. He asked about my son's favorite meals, and I found myself smiling as I shared stories. For a moment, it was easy to forget the shattered glass, the cold wind, the lines we weren't supposed to cross. But when our eyes met over the kitchen counter, that warmth flared again, dangerous and uninvited. I looked away quickly, my heart pounding. This is nothing, I told myself. Just a kid helping with dinner. But deep down, something told me that nothing was about to become much harder to ignore. The next morning, the house was filled with an uneasy quiet. The broken window, now covered with a sheet of plastic, flapped softly in the breeze. It was a constant reminder of yesterday's strange, tangled emotions. I stood in the kitchen, staring into my coffee cup, trying to shake off the feeling that the ground beneath me was shifting. Footsteps. I turned to see him enter, his dark hair damp from the shower, a casual smile on his face. "Morning," he said, his voice light, but there was something else in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe curiosity. "Morning," I replied, my tone more clipped than I intended. I busied myself at the sink, rinsing dishes that didn't need rinsing, trying to ignore the fact that the room felt smaller with him in it. Your son said he'd be out with friends all day, he mentioned casually. Do you want me to help with the window now? I paused, gripping the edge of the sink. The thought of spending the day alone with him made my chest tighten. You don't have to, I said, turning to face him. I'm sure you have other things to do. He shook his head. I promised I'd help. I exhaled, feeling trapped between wanting him to stay and knowing he shouldn't. All right, let's get to it then. We worked together in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the plastic-covered window. He held the replacement glass steady while I hammered the frame back into place. The closeness was unavoidable. Every time his shoulder brushed mine, heat rushed up my neck. I focused on the task, trying to ignore the scent of his soap, the warmth radiating from his skin. Almost done, I muttered, my voice strained. Good, he replied, his breath close enough that it stirred the hair near my temple. I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself. When I opened them, his gaze was on me, open and searching. I stepped back, creating distance. Thank you for helping, I said quickly. I don't know what I would have done without you. He smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in it. You're stronger than you think. Something in his tone made my heart skip. I wanted to tell him not to say things like that, not to look at me that way, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence stretched between us, thick with things we couldn't say. Daisy, our golden retriever, trotted into the room, breaking the tension. Her tail wagged as she nudged his hand, eager for attention. He laughed and knelt down, scratching behind her ears. Hey, girl, you keeping an eye on us? I smiled faintly. She's good at that. He looked up at me, his hand still buried in Daisy's fur. She's not the only one. I swallowed hard. I should start lunch. Can I help? He asked, standing. I hesitated. I wanted to say no, to create space, but my voice betrayed me. Sure. In the kitchen, we moved around each other, the silence more comfortable now. He chopped vegetables while I stirred the pot, our movements synchronized. Daisy curled up in the corner, watching us with curious eyes. He handed me a bowl, his fingers brushing mine. The spark was back, electric and undeniable. I looked up, meeting his gaze. We both froze, caught in that moment, the world narrowing to just the two of us. I started, but my voice trailed off. He stepped back, breaking the spell. Sorry, he murmured. I forced a smile, my heart pounding. It's okay, but it wasn't. It was getting harder to pretend, harder to ignore the lines we were dangerously close to crossing. I turned back to the stove, gripping the spoon tightly. The silence between us felt louder than ever, filled with the weight of what we couldn't allow ourselves to feel. The sun hung low in the sky by the time we finished lunch, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I cleared the plates, my hands steadying themselves against the smooth ceramic. I needed something, anything, to keep my mind occupied. He leaned against the counter, drying his hands on a dish towel, his gaze fixed on me, though he said nothing. The weight of unspoken words sat between us, like an unwelcome guest. Thank you for helping today, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. He nodded, a soft smile on his lips. I like being useful. His eyes lingered on mine for a second too long, as if searching for something I wasn't ready to give. The scrape of Daisy's paws against the tiles broke the silence. She trotted over, her tail wagging, sensing something in the air that I wished I could ignore. I knelt to scratch behind her ears, the familiar action grounding me. She trusts you, he said softly. Animals are easy to trust, I replied, not looking up. It's people who make things complicated. A quiet sigh escaped him. Yeah, I know what you mean. I finally met his gaze, my defenses slipping. In those eyes, I saw something that scared me. A reflection of my own loneliness, my own need to feel seen. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to shatter the tension, but nothing came. Do you ever take a break? He asked, his voice gentle. The question caught me off guard. I let out a dry laugh. Not really. There's always something that needs doing.
You deserve one, he said.
Even just a walk. Clear your head. I hesitated, torn between the safety of my routines and the pull of something unknown. But Daisy barked once, as if she agreed, and I found myself nodding. "Okay," I whispered. "Let's walk." We left the house, the cool breeze brushing against my face. Daisy bounded ahead, her joy infectious. He walked beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his presence both comforting and unsettling. We strolled in silence, the sound of our footsteps mixing with the rustling leaves. The street was quiet, the world wrapped in golden light. I breathed in, feeling the tension slowly unraveling. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I don't think you give yourself enough credit." I glanced at him, puzzled. For what? For keeping everything together. For being strong. I shook my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Sometimes I don't feel strong at all." He stopped walking, his eyes serious. "Strength isn't about never feeling weak. It's about showing up anyway." The honesty in his voice made my throat tighten. I looked away, watching Daisy chase a leaf in the breeze. "I guess I've forgotten how to show up for myself." He smiled, and for a moment everything felt still. "Maybe it's time to remember." Before I could respond, Daisy barked again, tugging on her leash. I laughed, the sound foreign but welcome. His smile widened, and in that instant, the cracks in my facade grew wider. The wall I'd built around myself felt dangerously close to collapsing. We turned back toward the house, the sky deepening to twilight. His hand brushed mine, just a fleeting touch, but it set off a ripple I couldn't ignore. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. We walked in silence, the unspoken understanding between us growing heavier with each step. And as we reached my front door, I realized I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't name, a precipice I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. The house felt different when we returned. The soft glow of the setting sun seeped through the windows, casting warm pools of light on the floor. Daisy settled by the door, her tail wagging lazily as she yawned and curled into a ball. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said. I hung my keys on the hook and turned to face him. "Thank you for the walk," I said, my voice more brittle than I intended. "I needed that." He nodded, his eyes searching mine. "I think you need more than just a walk." The air shifted. My pulse quickened, a low thrum echoing in my chest. I forced a smile, tried to deflect. "What I need is to finish these dishes." I turned toward the sink, hoping that moving, doing, would calm the storm inside me. But before I could take a step, he spoke again. "Why are you pushing me away?" I froze, my fingers brushing the edge of the counter. The question hung in the air, uncomfortably sharp. I closed my eyes for a second, gathering what was left of my composure. "Because this isn't right," I whispered. "Isn't it?" His voice was quiet, careful. "It feels right to me." I spun around, anger and confusion tangling inside me. "You don't understand. You have your whole life ahead of you. This, whatever this is, it can't happen." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away.
"Don't do that."
"Don't decide for me." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that this was foolish, that I was protecting him, protecting us both. But the words stuck in my throat. He took a step closer, his eyes steady and sincere. "You act like this is just a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't feel like one. Not to me." The honesty in his words cut through my defenses. I felt exposed, every carefully guarded part of me laid bare. I wanted to push him away, to put the walls back up, but my heart betrayed me. "Don't you see?" My voice trembled. "If we let this happen, it could ruin everything." He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Or maybe it could heal something," he said gently. "For both of us." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I quickly brushed it away. I can't let myself believe that." For a moment, he didn't say anything. The space between us shrank to a fragile thread. "You're scared," he said finally. "I get it, but I'm scared, too." The raw vulnerability in his voice undid me. My breath hitched, and I looked away, trying to steady myself. Daisy lifted her head, sensing the tension, her eyes wide and questioning. I knelt beside her, burying my fingers in her soft fur. Her warmth grounded me, reminding me of reality, of my responsibilities. "This isn't fair to you," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He crouched down next to me, his shoulder brushing mine. "You think I don't know that? I know what I'm getting into." I turned to face him, our eyes level. The ache in my chest was unbearable. "You deserve more than this, more than someone who's stuck in the past." "Maybe," he said softly, "but I want you." The words hung between us, so simple, yet so complicated. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I wanted to lean into him, to let go of everything holding me back. But the fear was too loud. I shook my head, my voice breaking. "I can't." He exhaled slowly, his face falling. He stood up, stepping away from me, and the loss of his warmth felt like a sudden chill. "Okay," he said, his voice hollow. "I get it." He turned toward the door, and Daisy whimpered, as if she knew something was breaking. As the door clicked shut behind him, a sob escaped my throat. I pressed my forehead against Daisy's back, the weight of my choice settling into me. I'd done the right thing. At least, that's what I told myself. But why did it feel like the walls were closing in? The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the hollow space of my chest. I stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, my hand tangled in Daisy's fur. She whimpered softly, her warm eyes questioning me, but I had no answers. My breath trembled as I tried to gather myself, to pull the shattered pieces of my resolve back together. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that pushing him away was the only choice. But the silence that followed felt different now, heavier, emptier. The air itself seemed to settle around me like a weight, pressing against my ribs. I stood slowly, my legs stiff, and walked into the living room. The sunlight had faded, leaving long shadows stretching across the floor. The window, now repaired, let in the dim glow of twilight. I traced a finger along the cool glass, remembering how he'd held it steady while I hammered the frame. I could almost hear his voice, soft and steady, telling me I was stronger than I thought. But right now, I didn't feel strong at all. I sank onto the couch, staring at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to crawl, each minute stretching endlessly. My mind replayed everything, his words, his eyes searching mine, the way his hand had lingered just long enough to make my heart race. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the memories burned brighter in the darkness. Daisy jumped up beside me, her head resting in my lap. Her steady warmth was a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I stroked her fur, my fingers shaking. "You're right here, aren't you?" I whispered. "You don't ask for explanations or permission. You just stay." A tear slipped down my cheek. I wanted to believe that space and silence would heal this, that time would smooth over the edges of what we'd almost let happen. But some part of me knew better. What I felt wasn't going to disappear just because I wished it away. I took a deep breath and stood up. I couldn't sit in this hollow space any longer. My feet carried me to the front door before I even knew what I was doing. The cool metal of the doorknob was grounding, a reminder that I still had choices left to make. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with the last light of day. I looked down the empty street, half expecting to see him there, walking back toward me. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of a world that kept moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I took another step, then stopped. The ache in my chest flared, but this time I let it be. I didn't push it away, didn't try to cover it with excuses. I let myself feel it, the loss, the longing, the fear of what might have been, and what still could be. Daisy nudged my leg, her eyes full of patient understanding. I looked down at her and managed a small, shaky smile. "Let's go back inside." We turned together, the door closing softly behind us. The house was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a pause, a space I needed to fill, not with regret, but with the slow, steady work of finding myself again. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I'd see him again. Maybe I wouldn't. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. like the world was wide enough for me to find my way back to something real, something solid. One step at a time, one choice after another. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.